welcome to the CARE podcast, where we are creating analytical repertoires effectively. I'm Mave Bajron.
And I'm Lindy West, and we are looking at verbal behavioral cusp, episode 1, clinical prerequisites. So the entire series will be focusing on verbal behaviorals and behavioral cusp, and hopefully we'll be doing a deep dive into each of those cusp as the episodes progress.
So, like I said, I'm Mave Bajron. I've been in the field of behavior analysis since 2020. I have a bachelor's in psychology and a master's of education in curriculum and instruction with a concentration in high incidence disabilities from Nicholls State University.
Say that 5 times fast.
It's a very long program name. I have to look it up every time someone asks me what my degree is specifically. And currently, I'm enrolled at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, getting my doctorate in behavior analysis. My areas of interest include high incidence disabilities, organizational behavior management, and verbal behavior.
And I am Lindy West. I have been in the field since 2011. I also have a bachelor's of psychology from McNeese State University. Graduated there in 2011. I received my master's of arts in psychology with a concentration in applied behavior analysis from McNeese State University in 2013. And I have owned and operated West Behavioral since 2013, which gives me a little different insight, I think, into the field, not only being a direct clinician, but also having some experience with the supervision and business owner aspect. My areas of interest include supervision, organizational behavior management, and verbal behavior.
So, with that, let's get into verbal development and practice. On the CARE podcast, we are looking to create analytical repertoires effectively. And so that means focusing on building clinical repertoires beyond just those curriculum-based interventions. The curriculum are fantastic, but we want something that starts with the philosophy and the science and works its way up to practice.
So I think just kind of diving back into the creating analytical repertoires effectively in the name CARE, we spent a lot of time going back and forth of what we wanted to accomplish with this podcast. And I think we both were on the same page in terms of developing the skill set of newer clinicians, maybe even some seasoned clinicians, and really developing skill sets that hopefully lend them to more effective treatment with their clients. So by focusing on cusp-based approach instead of a curriculum-based intervention, hopefully we can do that. And I think modeling the transfer of concepts into clinical practice is going to be really important as well. So not only will we in the future go in depth of each of these protocols, but we will also go into troubleshooting if you're not getting desired outcomes, and hopefully really giving you a good picture of what this will look like in your day-to-day life, right? Because it's always so interesting to go out there and read that research, but then actually applying it to what you're seeing with your clients is a completely different skill set. So hopefully we'll be able to work on that and help develop those skills.
So, as behavior analysts, we talk about the difference between a verbal repertoire and then the actual contingency shaped repertoire. And those two ideally are connected, but they're not always. And it sometimes can take some training to connect the two of those. And so hopefully that's what we're aiming to do here, is to bridge the gap between the concepts, right? The scientific principles of behavior analysis into the actual day-to-day contingency shaped and get you guys to achieve reinforcement by applying those principles in practice.
Absolutely. So what's to come? Kind of give us a spotlight of what the podcast is hopefully going to achieve. So of course today we are going to go over behavioral cusp, kind of what they are, hopefully convince you that it's your most ethically appropriate way to approach treatment. And also there is obviously lots of research out there to support that as well. Once we do that, future episodes, we're going to be working on additional clinical prerequisite skills, pre-verbal behavior, which there are quite a few cusps that fit within the pre-verbal behavior category, speaker skills, which are also going to have multiple cusps, listener, joiner of the speaker listener, social, and then some critical problem solving and decision making protocol and practice. So what does it look like? How do you move past this whenever your client is struggling and they're not making progress even with these protocols in place?
So let's talk about that. Whenever, you're doing all that you can and your client still seems to be struggling, right? So you're observing different things like a lack of learning in the natural environment. Maybe they do really well in the clinic, but then you put them into the real world or into a classroom or anywhere in the community, and they're really struggling to thrive there. Um, or even in the clinical environment, maybe they're showing slow or no progress on those typical assessments like ABLS or PEAK or AFLS or any of these other things. Whereas, maybe they flew through the beginning sections, but now they've really plateaued and you're not seeing that same skill development and growth anymore.
I think, that kind of lends itself to having discussions of if you are seeing that come up where the client is struggling, you'll kind of see sometimes where they'll like teeter back and forth between different prompt levels for programming. And usually because there's something bigger there, right? There's something that's more of a barrier in place. And so really diving into what portion is, serving to that barrier and what's actually happening instead of kind of just jumping back and forth between those prompt levels can be more efficient for your learner.
Right, right. Or, whenever you have to do these intense prompt levels and then fade them again and again, right, for each set of stimuli. And so to teach one target might take you 40 opportunities, right? Or maybe
Absolutely.
upwards, up to 100 opportunities because you're having to cycle through these different prompt levels. Um,
Absolutely. Or having to teach over multiple different stimuli, so they're not generalizing across stimuli. Maybe they're acquiring tacts, but they cannot tact a dog in the natural environment, or are unable. They can tact mom in the natural environment, but they can't tact a picture of mom. So those are definitely concerns if you're having to teach every single variation of that, which obviously is impossible. There are definitely some barriers in place to prevent them from progressing.
right. So in addition to seeing clients or learners that struggle with that stimulus generalization, you might also see them struggling with response generalization where they have to respond in these very rigid particular ways, and you don't get that natural contact with the environment that you're looking for.
Absolutely. Which I think, looking back, some of the criticism of ABA is creating these robotic type responses. And so whenever you have that and you have that lack of response generalization, I think you can kind of see that sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Or when learning is slow and requires a very particularly structured environment for learning to occur. Whereas, if the learner doesn't have three 4x6 picture cards in front of them and you say touch ball, that learning does not happen, there's a problem there. And they could be learning much quicker than they currently are.
Absolutely. I think that goes hand in hand with the next point, which is the client looks good on paper, but struggles in the natural environment. So you might have a client that technically is checking the boxes on ABLES, right? Or Peak or VB Map or whatever it is that you're using. But then whenever they go out in the natural environment, they still don't have those skill sets, and they're not able to use them. And so what ends up happening is one, that tightly controlled structure of the environment is actually controlling that behavior, right? Instead of the natural contingencies, which is what we ultimately need to see. But two, then at that point, they're probably only ever going to display those skills within that tightly controlled natural environment. So, now at this point, yeah, it's great that they can um, maybe label things in a clinical environment. But if you have a dog running at you that's clearly angry, and the child cannot scream dog and let you know that there's a dog coming up behind you, then obviously there's some concern there for safety reasons.
Right. And talk about those clients that look good on paper. It's really disappointing whenever if you encounter the circumstance where they have really high able score, they have really high peak score, right? They look great. And then the second you drop them into a classroom type setting, right? Because on your assessments, they should be ready for this less restrictive environment. You drop them in there and it immediately falls apart,
Yeah,
right?
that's a
They're
great
they're
point.
not prepared for the real environments out there.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So that goes to our next slide. We have a quote from Peter Durkis. He is an Austrian American consultant, educator, and author. So he has a great quote here that says, "There is nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency something that should not be done at all." And I don't remember which of the articles that we have in the references, but there was a sentence in there that very much so paraphrased this that said, "One child's cusp is another child's waste of time." And I think that speaks volumes in terms of when you're selecting behavioral cusp. what's going to be a cusp for one child is not necessarily going to be a cusp for another child based off of their unique environment, right? And so, of course, across the board, we're going to have some universal cusps, but when we're selecting these, we need to be very mindful of those things and very specific and individualized for this child and what we're trying to help this child achieve.
So our first keyword, if you are following along to get a CEU, is efficient. So maybe jot that down, or if you have a really good memory, just say it 3 times to yourself and you hold on to it. That is the first keyword, efficient. So what is the solution, right? So we want learners who are flexible. They can generalize all of their skills across any environment, any situation. Uh, the solution that we pose is a behavioral cusp approach to teaching, to instruction. So a behavior cusp describes an operant that, once learned, makes available a novel source of reinforcement. And the onset of cusps is shown to increase rates of learning and the situations that learning could occur. So
Uh,
let's look at.
Before you jump into the research, I remember whenever I first learned what a cusp was. Of course, that was a cusp all in itself, for a practitioner. But it was really mind blowing to realize that there are entire skill sets that lead to other skill sets and capabilities. And I think this is a piece that oftentimes is missed whenever you're just following that curriculum based instruction, because there's a lot of times your learner maybe doesn't have some of these prerequisites yet.
Right, yeah, so a cusp is almost always going to be a prerequisite to some other skill, or a prerequisite to a new environment, a
Yes,
prerequisite to a new reinforcer. Um, and so once it's gained, once the learner has the ability to do this behavior, this task, um, it just opens up so many more opportunities for learning. And that's what we're looking at, is increasing the efficiency at which they can learn, increasing the opportunities they have to learn, and increasing the rate of learning, maybe by increasing the reinforcing value of the natural reinforcers in the environment.
absolutely. So, of course, we're in ABA, so we absolutely love our data. We have tons of articles that are referenced at the end of the podcast, but let's look at a couple of them that we decided to highlight that show a behavioral cusp approach is going to be more efficient in the learning process.
Yeah, so this is one from uh, a name I will hardly attempt to pronounce.
I would not either.
And Greer. It is the effects of daily intensive tact instruction on preschool students' emission of pure tacts and mands in the non-instructional setting. All of that to say, so they took preschoolers in a natural preschool setting, and for multiple days they recorded how many natural tacts and mands were emitted by those preschoolers. And for all 3 of the participants, they found it to be very low. So what they did was the intensive tact intervention protocol, which is meant to induce one of behavioral cusps called naming. And this following the learner's success in meeting criteria for that protocol and the cusp naming, they went back and they measured how often are they tacting and manding in the natural environment. And so for all 3 participants, you see a stark increase in the number of spontaneous mands and tacts, spontaneous verbal behavior. Interestingly, naming only looked at tacting, right, and maybe listener skills, but they didn't touch manding at all. And yet, as a collateral, manding increased for all 3 participants also.
Yeah, it's really cool whenever you look at those sorts of effects and you start getting quote unquote like side effects of the intervention. In this case, obviously, it's something positive because you are seeing an increase in spontaneous mands. But I would say, that's one of the beauties of a behavioral cusp is sometimes it does lead to other cusps, which I think is amazing. And whenever you're looking at being able to compound that learning process, then now you have a learner that is much more efficient in any environment that they're in.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about behavioral cusp and pivotal response training. So both pivotal response training and behavioral cusp do play a significant role, but they do differ in scope. So we're going to talk about those two and how those are a little different, how they're the same. When we're looking specifically at pivotal response training, these are shown to display increases in communication skills, a reduction in symptoms of neurological diagnoses, and decreases in maladaptive behavior for some participants. they lead to a broad improvement in untrained behaviors, which is a really big piece that's going to go with pivotal response training. But similar to behavioral cusp, it's going to focus almost exclusively on naturalistic teaching. And specifically, when you're looking at pivotal response training, you're going to be targeting areas that are going to focus on motivation, self initiation, responding to multiple cues, and self management. So I think sometimes the waters can be a little muddied there when talking about the two of those, but they are two very different and distinct things.
Right. I would say that most pivotal responses could be considered a cusp, but not all cusps would be considered a pivotal response. And pivotal response training, like you said, focuses on naturalistic teaching, whereas if you're doing a cusp protocol to induce a behavioral cusp, it can often look very unnatural, very
Yes,
strange.
can look
Uh,
ridiculous sometimes.
but the goal is still in that generalization of untrained skills, right? Being able to learn in all sorts of environments, not just the rigid clinical type.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite things watching the conditioning faces protocol, especially whenever it's with a really young learner because, it can get really silly. And uh, the further they get into it, and of course, the more that is conditioned as a reinforcer, the more they start to join in on it. And it's really fun to see that process happen whenever they're really enjoying that silly face back to back play.
Yeah, conditioning faces is always a fun one, and conditioning voices, where it just looks like two people listen to a podcast while eating a snack.
Yeah,
It's very,
absolutely.
very, very fun.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about behavioral cusp examples, and then we're going to do a little deeper dive in what some of the traits are for behavioral cusp. So, the first one we're going to talk about is crawling. So, when a baby's learning how to crawl, it does increase access to the environment and its contingencies. So, when you think about a young child and they're to the point that they can sit up by themselves, so the parent can place them on maybe a blanket, put some toys around them. The only access that they have is whatever is placed near them, right? Because they can't move around, they can't access new things on their own. So their environment is very limited to the reinforcers that are currently present within arm's reach. But once the baby can crawl, now they can access toys, family, other things,
Or things
maybe
to put in their mouth.
yeah, things we don't want them to access sometimes. But now they can encounter all of these things. They might even encounter obstacles, which further shape the baby's behavior and may actually lead to like walking. So they get to a set of stairs, and now they can't obviously crawl down the stairs, maybe within reason. But they might start to engage in kind of standing and stepping down the stairs instead of trying to scoot on their bottom down the stairs, which, is very fun when you're an older kid, but probably pretty scary when you're an infant. So crawling definitely would be an example of that.
So running would be another cusp, um, because you think given enough time, anyone could crawl from one point to another, and yet most of us don't spend our whole life crawling from one point to another. We stand up, we walk, or even if we need to be even faster, we might run different places. So, what is the use of running, right? If we have all these other skills that are equally useful, right? We could get there eventually. Why does running ever arise? What are the circumstances that cause one to engage in running? So perhaps the child observes someone or a group of kids playing in a game of chase. If you try to crawl or walk your way through a game of chase, you're going to lose frequently, and you're probably not going to have a very fun time. So, you talk about these circumstances that would evoke these new cusps, right? Watching other kids play chase is the circumstance that demands that you learn this new behavior or begin to shape up this new behavior, such as running, so that you can keep up with everything else. So in this case, running is now differentially selected as the valuable behavior in this circumstance. And once gained, that learner isn't going to lose the ability to run. They're going to hold on to it and they can use it to engage in more and more circumstances elsewhere also.
Like running away from a bear.
That's
You do not want to crawl away from a bear.
no, or walk.
Yeah,
I mean, you'll look
absolutely.
cool until the bear
Yeah.
catches up to you.
Yeah, hopefully those skills are already established before you get put in that situation. Definitely not the time to establish the running cusp for sure.
But that is an example of it being maintained naturally in the environment. So once
Unfortunately.
once you've learned running, now you can run away from a bear, you can run after the ice cream truck, all these new
Mm,
opportunities that are now available to you for you to continue to exercise this new operant that you have gained.
that's a good idea. Okay, so whenever we're looking at this, there are certain traits that we're looking at to determine if something is a behavioral cusp. So they have some core traits, and then they have some variable traits. So core traits would be looking at, does it result in access to new reinforcers, contingencies, and environments? And for me, that's the biggest one out of all of our list here, because if it's not allowing access to those things, then I would say it's probably more like in the pivotal response training component, depending on what it's focusing on. But if you're accessing those things, then yeah, it's definitely setting you up to determine that this is a behavioral cusp. Is the behavior socially valid? So we were talking a while ago about selecting out certain behaviors naturally in the environment. So what value does this hold for the individual and their environments? It does have to be an operant, which is another core trait of that. And then whenever you're looking at this, they also have variable traits. So these may be present in behavioral cusp, but it may not be a generalized blanket uniform thing across all cusps. All right. The other piece of that is variable traits. So these may be present in some behavioral cusps, but it's not necessarily a blanket statement across all behavioral cusps. So the behavior allows for generalization of wide number of behaviors. So maybe we're looking at additional behaviors or cusps that are developing because of this cusp. The behavior competes with inappropriate responses, which again may be something that we would see with behavioral cusp, but is not a necessity. And or the behavior affects a large number of people. Walking and crawling would be great examples of that. Again, driving cars. If you are living in, a rural area like this, obviously you're probably going to need to drive a car to access majority of things, healthcare, groceries, even social environments. Versus if you live in New York City, driving a car is not necessarily a behavioral cusp in that type of setting the same way that it would be here. So that one I think is going to depend on the circumstances that the individual is in and what that natural environment is. But I do think that the more of these traits that you have present, the more likely it is that you're looking at a behavioral cusp.
Right. Very similar to the car one is the ability to navigate a smartphone would be
Mm,
another behavioral cusp. Because once you've gained this skill to open up a smartphone, maybe dial in a phone number, work a keypad, that opens up so many more opportunities, right? You can meet people on Bumble. You can order food on DoorDash, right? You have so many more environments, digital environments, or even physical environments, right? You can call yourself an Uber, and you
yeah.
have a whole new world that opens up to you. That's another one that affects a large number of people. You can just start calling random people, and it affects all of them. But even more fundamental than driving a car or using a smartphone is all of our verbal behaviors, right? Each verbal operant is its own behavioral cusp because once you have the ability to demand, to make requests, that opens up so many more opportunities for you. And same for tacting, right? Or interverbal responses. Think of how quiet the world would be if none of us had these interverbal responses. But once you do, it allows you to engage in all sorts of conversations, get so much more reinforcement about all of your favorite things or the weather.
Absolutely. So, looking at those behavioral cusps and kind of breaking it down, looking at different things that we would see develop, it exposes the individual to new environments, which we previously mentioned. These are going to be new reinforcers, new punishers, new contingencies, right? So, now the individual is going to have all sorts of new contingencies in the environment. And that could be access to certain communities that are going to reinforce certain contingencies. New responses, new stimulus control, and then new communities to maintain behavior.
Right. And when we talk about new reinforcers or new punishers, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a novel stimuli in the environment that is a reinforcer. Sometimes that means a stimuli that was already present is now functioning as a reinforcer, right? Same with new contingencies. It could be, they're encountering all the same stimuli, but now it is affecting them as a contingency would. Same for new stimulus controls, right? It could be that, someone was always calling their name, but now they have that skill of attending when their name is called. And so that opens up so many more opportunities for learning to happen. in this, again, in the natural environment.
Absolutely. A great example of that, recently, we had a child that has developed conditioning reinforcement for faces and voices. And the caregiver was reporting how social the child is now, compared to even a year ago and 2 years ago. And just kind of giving some anecdote information of what the child was like maybe at the age of 2 or 3 compared to what the child is now, and the difference it makes in social settings, like going out in public and those sorts of things. And makes a huge difference for the child, obviously, and their caregivers. But now the child is actually seeking out those engagements, which just kind of opens the door in general for all sorts of future learning. Now that the child is not only a unwilling participant, but actually seeking those out and excited about that.
And behavioral cusp, they always expand the individual's repertoire, right? Both directly by teaching this new skill, this new operant, but it almost always has this collateral effect of opening the doors for all these new and further skill development to take place. Um, so behavioral cusps arise whenever an individual encounters some contingency, some circumstance that differentially selects the maintenance of the new repertoire over the old one. So there's some environmental change that makes this skill development necessary and beneficial for the learner over and above the previous. For instance, encountering stairs or a couch differentially selects standing and walking over crawling. And in the same way, it leads to further cusps. So once you're able to walk, then you're able to run, then you're able to, I don't know, jump after that. I don't imagine it's capable to jump while crawling.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see for sure. I think going hand in hand back at looking at verbal behavior cusp, if you don't have conditioning faces and conditioning voices, then the likelihood of conditioning and developing, sorry, man's would be very low, right? Man's tax, introverbals, all of those sorts of things, that's going to be extremely low. And so, whenever you're looking at your learner's repertoire and you're looking at some of the skills that you're trying to develop, that might be something that's pertinent to look at is, does the client have the prerequisites that are supposed to be in place in terms of behavioral cusp in order to develop these verbal skills.
So there's a lot of cusps that are universal to the human race, like conditioning, condition reinforcement for listening to voices, condition reinforcement for looking at human faces, manding, tacting, echoics, right? A lot of these are universal, but then very many of them are also unique to that specific individual or that specific environment, right? We talked about how driving might be a cusp for one person living in an urban area and not for someone living in the middle of New York or some other walkable city. Uh, and same, it's also time dependent, where using a smartphone today is absolutely a cusp that opens up so many opportunities. Using a smartphone 300 years ago, first of all, how would you know how to use smartphone 300 years ago? And second of all, it's pretty useless because no one else has one.
Eskimos. So there's a lot of research that I've seen on Eskimos being able to identify different colors of snow. And it has to do with, like the texture of the snow, and I don't know a lot about snow, but it has a lot to do with safety things for them, right? And so that's developed over time. And so imagine if you were, picked up from South Louisiana and dropped in Alaska. And then now all of a sudden you're placed in the situation where it's very dangerous for you if you don't, or you're unable to recognize certain types of snow and the conditions that go along with it, right? And so that would be a cusp that you would very quickly have to develop in order to survive in that particular environment. Not something you will ever need here, but just goes to show that the environment can play a huge role in what is a unique cusp for an individual.
Absolutely. So our second keyword, if you're following along for the CEU, is crawling. So again, jot that down unless your memory is better than mine. It is crawling.
All right. So now we're going to talk about natural sources for verbal behavioral cusp. So we've talked a lot about the cusp and kind of what their core traits are. And so, how does a typically developing individual get there, right? Because we're talking about inducing those things with a lot of the learners that we work with. And so, if we're having to induce it, it has to happen at some point with a naturally developing um, contingency or naturally developing process with an individual. So, looking at these for conditioning reinforcement for attending to voices, speaking while feeding is a huge aspect of that. So, you have a newborn infant and you are, up for those late night feedings and you are, talking to them, you're kind of trying to soothe them as you're providing that bottle, right? And so those things are being paired. And over time, those voices are going to start to, or attending to the voices is going to start to become something that you see selected out for that individual. Same thing with stimulus pairing procedure, which I would say most behavior analysts are extremely well versed in this type of procedure. But you do see this whenever a child is developing naturally in your utero. And so, not sure the mechanics of it, of how that happens, but I would assume that there's probably some comfort there. Like, as the parent is talking, there's probably like some vibrations happening that are, probably soothing to the child. There's also lots of nutrients that are present in that environment. So that's being paired with that as well. So these things are happening very naturally. And you even see that with a newborn, right? Mom's in the hospital and mom talks. And even though the newborn can't see all that well, they will orient over to the mother's face and or mother's voice. And that's, kind of the early signs of that. And you continue to see that develop and grow even stronger over time and throughout infancy as more of those pairings take place.
Right. So y- most neurotypical kids are born with this conditioned reinforcement for attending to voices or attempting to attend to voices. They
Yeah.
don't know the source of the voice yet, but you see babies, they kind of look around and they're interested in human voices. And so from the start, they're already listening, right, to some degree. Maybe not being able to parse out what these different syllables mean, but they're at least attending to the sound, right? Then picture a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, maybe a 7, 10-year-old who still does not have this conditioned reinforcement for attending to voices. It means they're missing out on all these years of listening skills, right? They're they're so far behind in their ability to attend, and they've missed so many opportunities to learn these different words all along. And so that's why we employ this cusp-based approach, where we look at the prerequisites and try to catch them up to speed using these different protocols. It's This goes back to why a behavioral cusp is necessarily an operant, right? We're not born automatically attending to all of these different things. We're not born the ability to speak to man, to make all these requests. We have to learn it. And so if something went awry and you don't have that skill, we need to teach it as quickly as possible to get them back on track as much as we can.
Going back to what you said about, years worth of missed opportunities, essentially. I don't remember what the number is, but I think it's around 24,000 words a day that mothers typically will model to their children. And so if you do not have the attending to adult voices component, right, that behavioral cusp is missing, now imagine how many opportunities, even on a daily basis, that you're missing. And then you compound that times 4 years, 5 years, sometimes even 8 years. Once you start doing that math, it's really crazy how many opportunities are being missed there.
Yep, yep. And very similar is condition reinforcement for attending to faces. So babies are not born looking at faces. They've never seen a face before. Uh, but it gets paired with voices, right? They eventually will figure out, like, oh, that's where the sound is coming from, right? So they're going to pay attention to face a little bit more. It's also paired with feeding, whether feeding with a bobble or you're breastfeeding. They're kind of poised just because of the way we hold babies when you feed them to look you right in the face. And so there's that stimulus pairing happening where they're pairing the food again with looking at faces, and that becomes a reinforcer. And then attending to faces is a behavioral cusp because our faces carry so much information. Uh, Whether it's a frown or a smile or a disgust face, there's so much to be learned from observing faces. So our hypothetical baby is attending to voices. They are attending to faces. What's next for them in their learning progress?
So naturally, it would be babbling, right? And so you see a child develop um, whenever they have those conditioning faces and conditioning voices. They're attending to the parent. A lot of times the parent will start to model those things to the baby, right? You have them sitting in like a little jumper or something like that, and you're kind of like making faces at them and making noises. And so the natural progression of that is the child starting to kind of imitate those sounds. Maybe not perfectly, right? Maybe they're just kind of babbling initially, and then that gets shaped over time. But the tactile feedback serves to condition the parroting and the babbling. And you'll see that the babbles are shaped by the social interaction into words as time goes on. So maybe initially the child's just kind of throwing sounds out there, right? And then they finally hit one. Maybe mom and dad are standing right there, and usually the one of the first sounds they make is like the da sound, right? And then everybody gets super excited because they think the baby's trying to say dad. And so over time that gets selected out, and then that shaping process just continues over time until we actually get fully formed words, and then we can develop additional behavioral cusp now that we can imitate the words of other people.
Right. So now that the kid is making these different sounds, like ma, a dad, daddy, right, gets more and more complicated. They're encountering so much more reinforcement for all of these verbal behaviors that they're engaging in, like whenever they start to tack to dad or man for mom. And so then their verbal vocabulary continues to grow and expand until eventually they encounter the naming cusp, whether you're talking about unidirectional naming or bidirectional naming, or just summed up in general as naming. So, naming describes the ability for a learner to hear something, hear someone else describe something in the environment, and then they pick up that name and they can use that name later in the future, whether in the listener role or in the speaker role. And so this occurs from a synthesis of robust listener and speaker repertoires. They've been listening to a lot, they've been saying a lot, and eventually those wires get connected and they're able to fluently bounce back and forth. They learn some word in the speaker role and they can use it in the listener sense and vice versa.
Going back to what we talked about earlier, if you're teaching just strictly based off of the curriculum based instruction, you're having to teach every single tact, every single receptive identification, sometimes to painstakingly lengths, right? Compared to if you have a child that has the naming capability, now I can teach the tact and I can get the receptive for free, right? And so it's a much more efficient model.
Or even something like transfer of stimulus control between the tact function and the man function. You may have to teach them separately and hope that they get connected, right? Or you teach the tact and you hope that they can do the man, as opposed to using a verbal behavioral cusp approach where you can make sure they have the prerequisites in place, like naming, and then you know guaranteed that they're going to connect those and that you can cut down the amount of time you have to spend teaching significantly, and also increase their learning in the natural environment again, because you're not going to follow them around teaching them to tact for every single thing in their living room. But if they can learn from when mom says, hey, hand me the vase, right, or hand me the TV remote, or some avant-garde sculpture in the living room, that they're going to remember the name of that and be able to use it flexibly. So naming also occurs from this natural multiple exemplar instruction that children receive throughout their lives. So parents or caregivers saying, "Hey, hand me this. Go grab this." There's the listener exposure, and then maybe sometimes being asked, hey, "What is this?" Right? Or find my matching shoe. Right? All of these different, just natural multiple exemplar instruction induces the naming cusp.
So, switching gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about efficiency of teaching. So, I think whenever we're looking at that and really diving into what is our ethical obligation here to teach from a cuff based approach versus a curriculum based approach, there are a lot of ethical codes I think that we could have looked at, but we did highlight four. 2.13 implements with focus on maximizing benefits. 2.14 behavior analysts also consider relevant factors such as risk, benefits, and implements behavior change interventions to produce outcomes likely to maintain under naturalistic conditions. 2.19 behavior analysts actively identify and address environmental conditions such as the behaviors of others, hazards to the client or staff, disruptions. This may interfere with or prevent service delivery. In such situations, behavior analysts remove or minimize the conditions. identify effective modifications to the intervention, and or consider obtaining or recommending assistance from other professionals. Behavior analysts document conditions, all actions taken, and the eventual outcomes. And 3.01, behavior analysts act in the best interest of the client, taking appropriate steps to support client rights, maximize benefits, and do no harm. So those are the four that we highlighted. Um, Kind of diving into those, we've talked a lot about maximizing or making most efficient the learning process. And I think whenever we're looking at those four, they all support that. We have to look at maximizing the desired outcomes. And we have another little quote here from Peter Durkis that says, "We now accept the fact that learning is a lifelong process, keeping abreast the chain of change. The most pressing task is to teach people how to learn." Right, and we were talking about that a while ago with the naming. If I'm teaching them a more efficient way to learn, and now I'm quote unquote kind of getting some learning for free, now I'm actually getting to the process where I'm teaching them how to be a more efficient learner, which goes hand in hand with all four of those ethical codes that we looked at. And I think we have to kind of ask ourselves, is effective comparable to efficient? Like, we could utilize any of those teaching strategies and eventually get them there, but if we can induce a behavioral cusp and get them there that much faster, that's the option we need to go with, based off of our ethical code and research that we have to support it.
Right. So if a learner is missing cusps, we maybe ask them to crawl somewhere when they could learn to walk there or run there and get there so much quicker. Right. So yeah, they could crawl there. I could teach them to tack this cow, and it would only take me 300 learn units, right? 300
Right.
opportunities for them to be
Right.
able to attack this cow. And they did it, right? They can attack the cow now. But that is, I wouldn't say efficient in the slightest, right?
Agreed.
Instead, if you could ensure that all of the correct prerequisites are in place, all of those necessary cusps for learning effectively and efficiently, then maybe they learn to attack the cow in like 3 opportunities, maybe even 20 opportunities, significantly less time. um, and we talked about maximizing the desired outcome. That's what this means, is ensuring that they are set up to learn as efficiently as possible. Um, and if you have to show them a picture of a cow 300 times in order for them to attack this cow, by the end, they're going to be darn tired of looking at that cow.
Yes. And you will be too.
Yes, yes. And so, are we requiring them to crawl somewhere that they could just as easily run to?
Absolutely. And I think, looking at the next part, the removal of barriers to service delivery. If we are teaching from a curriculum based approach specifically and not taking a behavioral cusp approach, then we are essentially ignoring that entire ethical obligation that we have. And so, by identifying and addressing those barriers through inducing behavioral cusp, we are actually going to be removing some of the barriers to service delivery for our clients.
Right. Because, most of our clients are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And autism is not a learning disability, it's a developmental disability. So there's no reason it should take 300 opportunities for them to learn this one skill. It, if it is, there's a barrier there, and we have an ethical obligation to remove that barrier to the treatment process.
Absolutely. And our research supports this. It supports the use of cusp-based approach. We have a lot of research that is on our reference page. We will look at a couple of more in depth later during the slideshow, but I think that there's more than enough research out there to show that this is something that is more efficient and more effective. And from an ethical standpoint, it is something that we definitely need to do. So beyond ethics, and I know this is kind of more of my wheelhouse, arguing with insurance companies, but whenever we're looking at it from an insurance and medical necessity and even other considerations, whenever we're making treatment decisions, I think there's a lot of different pieces of that we need to consider. So whenever we're looking at it, the term medically necessary does kind of differ a little bit depending on what the diagnostic criteria is going to be, right? So, depending on what the diagnosis is. But the big piece of it is that medically necessary refers to services that correct or ameliorate the individual's physical or mental condition, right? And so that's going to be linked to their actual individual diagnosis. So this goes back to code 2.13 whenever we're looking at what we're focusing on and the targets that we're selecting, right? So if I am selecting a target of tacting and introverbals, but the client doesn't yet have conditioning print for 2D STEM and conditioning voices, those targets are not medically necessary for my client at this particular time. Doesn't mean they won't be in the future, and hopefully they will be, right? I can go back and I can induce those cusps. But then at that point, those are medically necessary. If I am throwing that at the client day one and they don't have these prerequisite behavioral cusps, then I'm actually not providing medically necessary treatment for that client at that point. Goes back to our quote that we said in the beginning: one child's cusp is another child's waste of time, right?
Absolutely. And so the cusp-based approach allows for goals related specifically to that diagnosis criteria and the socially significant outcomes for that individual in particular, right? Just because there's a score related to that particular skill doesn't mean in this moment is medically necessary for that client, though it could be eventually if you have all the prerequisites knocked out of the way.
Absolutely. I think another piece of this is you can use the cusp based approach to advocate for placement for your client. And also when you are formulating our recommendations for your treatment authorization request. So, for example, if I'm determining the number of units that might be most appropriate for this learner, and I'm trying to formulate some sort of recommendation off of that for treatment, then looking at those cusp based approach is going to lend a helping hand whenever I'm actually trying to support my argument for those things, right? Support my decisions for those things. So, for example, if I have a client that is missing most of the preverbal cusp, whenever I'm looking at all of their assessment scores, then that child is probably going to benefit from a higher number of learn units per week. And so I probably should be recommending a higher number of treatment hours versus if this is a client that has maybe just some of the print cusp missing, right? Maybe they have all the pre-verbal cusp, they have a print cusp missing. That is still going to deter and be a barrier to some learning. But we're not necessarily going to be recommending 40 hours a week for that client. And I think that's a big piece with this is it's not medically necessary to recommend that for every single client. And so by looking at what the client has, what the deficits are, in terms of the barriers in the behavioral cusp, you really can make a solid recommendation of how many hours the client will need in order to remediate those cusps.
Right. And talking about advocating for placement, right? You might have a learner who is in the school setting and maybe they're fine, like they're sitting there all day, they're not a disruption. But during this assessment, you find out that they're missing all of these social cusps, that they're not really paying attention to what their peers are doing or even what the teacher is doing, right? Maybe they're missing that observational learning component, or they're even missing that listener repertoire. They're not paying attention to the teacher at all. Sure, they can be in the classroom, but they're not benefiting whatsoever from that classroom setting. And so the cusp-based approach guides you to say, hey, we need to get these prerequisites down first, and then we can put them back in the classroom.
Absolutely. I would say you could probably even argue the opposite as well. If the client has all the pre-verbal cusp, they have um, the speaker and the listener cusp, and they're getting into those higher developmental cusp, they have the social cusp, and you still have them in a clinical environment on a one-to-one basis. That is not the most efficient means or least restrictive environment for that client. And so I think that kind of goes both ways of you have to also look at this and be able to say now is the time that they need to be around more age typical peers, right? They have um, this basis now that they could go into that environment, they could be successful. Now it's our ethical obligation to actually make that recommendation and advocate for that transition because the cusps that are present support that.
Even if there's still work to be done in the clinical environment, if you can argue that there is something to be gained for the learner by being around peers that they can also learn from because they have these social cusps, that should be your recommendation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a risk benefit analysis there of what placement or maybe mixture of placements is going to lead to the most efficient outcomes for the client based on their particular skill set.
100%. So we're talking a lot about, all these different cusps. And there are significant benefits to inducing these cuffs. So, for example, conditioning voices, right? Whenever the learner it has conditioned reinforcement for attending to human voices, there are multiple studies that show there's a drastic increase in the rate of learning. The number of opportunities required for them to learn a skill decreases significantly. And they also display increased attending to speakers, which again opens up the doors for so many more learning opportunities. Same for conditioned reinforcement for attending to faces. There is more research showing that there is, again, an increased rate of learning and increased attending to speakers in the environment.
And so, whenever you're looking at naming in particular, it's closely linked to accelerated learning from discrete trial training. So, we kind of touched on that earlier. If I can train it in one aspect and then it is utilized in another aspect, and I get that for free, then now all of a sudden we have learning happening at a much more rapid rate, whether it be transfer stimulus control, um, from manding to tact or tact to manding or tact to receptive ID, any of those sorts of things, you definitely will see exponential learning happening compared to having to teach all of those things individually.
Same with the generalization across stimuli. So, pre naming cusp, you might have to teach each and every version of something, right? Each exemplar separately. But post naming, there's research to show that they can generalize across the stimuli much easier. And so, again, you're getting all this learning for free.
I think whenever you're looking at that, they also have the increased incidental learning from the natural environment. Research supports that, and therefore, at that point, you have increased responsiveness to instruction in the school setting. So, kind of going back to advocating for the appropriate placement for your client in the least restrictive manner. If they have those naming capabilities, and now all of a sudden they are much more responsive in the classroom type setting, and maybe there is still work to be done, but now they can acquire those in that environment. It's definitely something that you want to advocate for.
Absolutely. And so, with that, our third keyword is incidental. Again, that is incidental. So, let's take a look at the effects of naming. Um, Sorry for those who are listening only. We have up some graphs here. So Kim et al. Looked at inducing listener skills, right? Those listener cusps using an emergent listener fluency protocol. And what they found was in these preschoolers, uh, the rate of correct responding to these natural listener instructions being emitted by the caregivers in that environment. So the teachers would say, "All right, everyone, put your backpacks on, or line up, do this, do that." Lots of opportunities in the school setting, right? Lots of different opportunities for these learners to emit the correct response. Many of these preschoolers were not because they were missing those listener cusps, those prerequisites, even before they can engage in the correct response. They're missing the skills to do so. And so the researchers, Kim et al., induced listener skills using this listener protocol, and they found a drastic increase in the number of correct opportunities. So you can see the preschoolers are encountering that reinforcement so much more often with the cusp than without these new learning environments. And with that, new new words are going to be learned, right? Because now they're able to attend to the listener instructions. They're going to gain many more listener instructions that they're able to comply with.
All right. So the next article we have is uh, Maffei, Singer, Dudek, and Cohane. This is in 2014. It's the effects of establishment of adult faces and or voices as conditioned reinforcers for children with ADS and related disorders. So this was looking at obviously inducing the facing and naming behavioral cusp. They use this by measuring a 5 second whole interval recording for a 5 minute probe. And then, sorry for those that are just listening, the graph shows that the field bore is observing faces, so looking at the faces of others, orienting towards the faces of others. And the unfilled bore shows that they are having approach response for voices, so pressing a button or making the adult voice present in the environment. So this is where they're actually seeking out that adult voice, which when you're doing the conditioning reinforcement for adult voices protocol can seem a little funny sometimes when you're working through that. But so what you see here is a drastic increase. in both of those compared to your baseline level. So they had 4 different participants. They did a multiple baseline design across this. And whenever they're looking at this, you're seeing a drastic increase um, for both the observing faces and the approaching responses for voices.
Right, which again opens up many more opportunities for learning in the natural environment.
Absolutely. So, we have been talking a lot about cusp-based approach. Obviously, that's our whole goal. And as the podcast continues, we're going to dive into each of those protocols and how to induce that kind of troubleshooting with inducing those and dive into those a little bit deeper. But we wanted to give you some resources for a cusp-based approach. Some of the resources that we pulled from, in addition to the list of resources that we have down, we wanted to highlight these. So, the first one we're going to talk about is the Early Learner Curriculum and Achievement Record. I absolutely love this one. So, this is the LCAR. We use it all the time in our clinic. The big piece of this is not only is it going to test for some of those direct skills like you would see in VB or Peak or ABLES, but it also has some of the direct testing components for the behavioral cusp, specifically looking at the pre-verbal behavior cusp. So it's going to look for that conditioning adult faces, conditioning adult voices, environmental sounds.
Not a cusp. It seems like it would be a cusp. It's
Yes.
not considered.
Yes, it's in that
It's
pre-verbal screening though.
it's not on the pie chart as one of the main
Yes.
cusps.
Yes.
It is a cusp, but it's a little further down on the
On the list.
priority.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a couple other ones in there. It does have the parroting. Trying to think which other one it has in there.
Voices,
Oh, 2D
faces.
and 3D.
Yes,
Yeah, 2D
attending
and
to
3D.
2D
Yes.
stimuli, attending to 3D stimuli.
Yes. Yeah, so it does have all of those components in there. So if you are not familiar with it, I think it would be great to check out.
Now, if you're writing treatment plans, it's often not enough for insurance, right?
Yes,
They want some of those more standardized ones that you always see, like Abel's and Peak. But uh, in terms of arguing for placement or displaying to caregivers why you're making the decisions that you are, I think it's really neat to have the LCAR on there.
absolutely. And it kind of depends on the insurance company that you're working with. So we've had some insurance companies, obviously it's not a standardized measure yet for them. So they kind of don't really know what it is. But whenever I have had like peer reviews and different things like that, and I explain what we're looking at in the behavioral cusp and how it relates to remediating the symptoms of the diagnosis, they are always very happy with us having that. And so sometimes it just kind of depends on what their internal policies are of like what they're looking for there. But like you said, I do think it's really important to be able to use it to advocate for certain placement and certain hours, because now you actually have a reason and something to go back to say that this is specifically why I think this would be the best for this client.
And it makes sense why why it's not as good of a benchmark for general skill repertoires because the LCAR does have a lot less skills on it, right?
Yes.
Is looking at just these fundamental cusps for learning, and as opposed to Abel's, which has like 1,500
Right.
different skill
Absolutely.
points on there. So it makes it a little difficult to compare, but I think it's critical for understanding and explaining why those able scars are the way that they are
Yeah.
or why the peak scores look like this. You can look back and say, hey, look, they're not even listening when you talk to them. This is what we got to get down first.
Absolutely. And I think, like we've been talking a lot about the, curriculum based approach, and like we are no means picking on that. I think those things are very useful as tools, but the important thing and the takeaway should be that that is not used as a roadmap of how to get there. It is simply used as a testing tool to determine where the client currently is, right? And so if I am using ABLES, for example, and I see that the client is missing most of the tacting column. So instead of jumping in and saying, like, okay, they're missing all of these tacting scores within this particular type of scoring curriculum, instead of jumping in and just kind of running through those tacting programs, which I could do, I could throw 20 tacting programs at them, right? One of the first things I want to do is go back to possibly even LCAR and look at what behavioral cusp they need in order to be successful to learn those tacting protocols. And do I need to induce those first?
This is looking at the why,
Yes.
right? So it's one thing to say, oh, their tacting is low. But it's another to say, why is their tacting so low, right? Because if they're in a typical household, they've had plenty of opportunities to learn the tact for a shirt, for a shoe, for pants, right? They should have we attack all these different things, um, but they're not, right? And so Elcar and the verbal cusp approach is looking at what was missing, what went awry, so that they're not at the skill level they should.
Yeah, and I think, whenever you're looking at this kind of goes hand in hand with why the exposure idea or the idea behind exposure doesn't always lead to results, right? So I can continually expose a learner to something, right? Shirt, this is a shirt. I can expose them to that hundreds of thousands of times if I want to, but if they don't have conditioning adult voices, then the chance of them actually learning from any of those opportunities is extremely, extremely low.
Right. And so, well, if you talk about what is a stimuli in that person's environment, or even what is that person's environment, if they're not attending to voices, if they're not attending to three-dimensional stimuli, if they're not attending to two-dimensional stimuli, then you can be making all this noise around them. You can be waving all these things in front of them, but is not a part of their environment until they have the ability to attend to it. Which is why, it's not enough to just stick them in the classroom. They're going to soak it up eventually. No, that's not how learning happens. Learning happens from, you know, emitting a response, right? In this case, it may just be attending, being the response of attending to something. Does a learner have the ability to even attend to it yet?
Right, absolutely. So some other resources are the verbal behavior analysis by Greer and Ross. I think almost everything that we have has a reference to Greer. He was kind of like our standard for our research for this. The verbal developmental assessment, also by Greer and Speckman. And then the separate development of children's listener and speaker behavior and the intercept as behavioral metamorphosis, which is also by Greer. This was an article that Mave came across that I absolutely have loved. I think it breaks the thing I like about it is within it, it'll actually show this is the behavioral cusp that you're missing. And then on the side of that, it has a reference for this is the protocol that you can reference for inducing that cusp.
Right. Yeah, it's a fantastic article. It's very long. It has
It is.
so much good information, though, and I would think I'd recommend that as a starting point,
Yes.
besides listening to the rest of this podcast.
Yes. That too.
But that is a fantastic article that breaks down what a cusp is and why they're important, and then it has all these references to plenty and plenty and plenty of articles. We have a lot of references to articles,
We
but they
do.
have just as much, if not more, and specifically linking to those protocols, like you said. So here's the
Absolutely.
skill that they're missing. This is what it looks like when they are missing it, and then this is the protocol that has been scientifically validated, and at least a few learners to induce that.
Absolutely. I also loved like the caterpillar and butterfly analogy in there. I think it's really cool. And whenever you're kind of trying to get this point across to technicians, I think it's really cool to kind of define those like, hey, this kid's just a caterpillar, and so like they have these skill sets, and so whenever you're presenting incidental learning to them, this is the most effective way to do it, versus this kid is now a butterfly, so we need to be focusing on these things, which is just a really fun way to talk about it.
Yeah, very cute, very cute. So then, here are all of our references. We'll kind of go through those while we fade out. Is there anything else that you wish to say?
Absolutely not. I think we covered it all. I think the important points are we have more information to come on the future episodes where we're going to be doing a deep dive into each of these behavioral cusp, the protocols. So if you feel a little overwhelmed, that's okay. We threw a lot of information out at you. As we go on, this is going to be a deeper dive into each of those cusp, and hopefully you'll feel more solid on your decision making process, and then even some troubleshooting with each of those as well.
Right. So, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
The Care podcast can be found on Spotify and on YouTube. If you're interested in purchasing a CEU for this, log on to westbehavioral.com and move over to the CEUs tab. Thank you.